Good afternoon and welcome to the California Cannabis Industry Association's week of webinars. I am Josh Drayton. I am Communications and Outreach Director for CCIA. For those not familiar with CCIA, we are a statewide trade association. We formed in 2013, and at this point we represent all different license types, all regions of the state, as well as ancillary services provided to the cannabis industry. As we know, this has been a very unique year. We've come through many unique years, but this one in specific, dealing with COVID-19, addressing social equity during these times of civil unrest. And that is why we put together a week of webinars to try and give you as much real-time information as possible to help your businesses and also to forecast for the future. I'm very, very happy that we're finishing this week talking about social equity. This has been an issue and a challenge as the cannabis industry has been at the forefront of addressing social equity, what that can look like, how it can be implemented at a state level, at a local level. Social equity has been very challenged in finding successful pathways to bring in equity applicants into this regulated marketplace. So we're going to be talking about the ins and outs of that, especially at the state level for this first hour. From 1 till 2, we will be moving on to address the Los Angeles social equity efforts and what those challenges and successes have been. So please join us for the entire 2 hours if you can. I look forward to a very robust conversation with experts that have prioritized social equity through their businesses and through their efforts throughout the cannabis industry. So with that being said, I'm going to turn this over to Yvette McDowell of Yvette McDowell Consulting. Yvette is a board member of CCIA and also chairs the Diversity, Inclusion, and Social Equity Committee. So I'll turn it over to you, Yvette.
Fantastic, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad you're here. Today we are going to have a little walk through history, and we're going to bring that to the contemporary time that we're facing today with social equity and some of the many challenges that this program has seen since its inception. We have a great group of panelists here and we're ready to rock and roll. So if you would take it away, Josh, and start our intro, we're ready to go.
Absolutely. So one of the first things we're going to do to start off is we're going to watch an illustrated op-ed that Jay-Z did for the New York Times. It is illustrated by Molly Crabapple. This is from 2016, but it shares a history of the failed war on drugs. So to provide a little content for our discussion today, we're going to start with this, and then we will go ahead and get the full webinar started.
In 1986, when I was coming of age, Ronald Reagan doubled down on the war on drugs that had been started by Richard Nixon in 1971. Drugs were bad, fried your brain, and drug dealers were monsters. For the sole reason neighborhoods and major cities were failing. No one wanted to talk about Reaganomics and the ending of social safety nets, the defunding of schools and the loss of jobs in cities across America. Young men like me who hustled became the sole villain, and drug addicts lacked moral fortitude. In the 1990s, incarceration rates in the US blew up. Today, we imprison more people than any other country in the world. China, Russia, Iran, Cuba. All countries we consider autocratic and repressive. Yeah, more than them. Judges' hands were tied by tough on crime laws, and they were forced to hand out mandatory life sentences for simple possession and low-level drug sales. My home state of New York started this with Rockefeller laws. Then the feds made distinctions between people who sold powder cocaine and crack cocaine, even though they were the same drug. Only difference is how you take it. And even though white people used and sold crack more than black people, somehow it was black people who went to prison. The media ignored actual data to this day. Crack is still talked about as a black problem. The NYPD raided our Brooklyn neighborhoods while Manhattan bankers openly used coke with impunity. The war on drugs exploded the US prison population disproportionately, locking away Black and Latinos. Our prison population grew more than 900%. When the war on drugs began in 1971, our prison population was 200,000. Today it is over 2 million. Long after the crack era ended, we continued our war on drugs. There were more than 1.5 million drug arrests in 2014. More than 80% were for possession only. Almost half were for marijuana. People are finally talking about treating addiction to harder drugs as a health crisis, but there's no compassionate language about drug dealers. Unless, of course, we're talking about places like Colorado, whose state economy got a huge boost by the above ground marijuana industry. A few states south in Louisiana is still handing out mandatory sentences for people who sell weed. Despite a booming and celebrated 50 billion legal marijuana industry, most states still disproportionately hand out mandatory sentences to Black and Latinos with drug cases. If you're entrepreneurial and live in one of the many states that are passing legalized laws, you may still face barriers participating in the above ground economy. Venture capitalists migrate to these states to open multi-billion-dollar operations, but former felons can't open a dispensary. Lots of times those felonies were drug charges, caught by poor people who sold drugs for a living, but are now prohibited from participating in one of the fastest growing economies. Got it? In states like New York, where holding marijuana is no longer grounds for arrest, police issue possession citations in Black and Latino neighborhoods at a far higher rate than other neighborhoods. Kids in Crown Heights are constantly stopped and ticketed for trees. Kids at dorms in Columbia, where rates of marijuana use are equal to or worse than those in the hood, are never targeted or ticketed. Rates of drug use are as high as they were when Nixon declared the so-called war in 1971. 45 years later, it's time to rethink our policies and laws. The war on drugs is an epic fail.
All right. That's an introduction to set the stage for where we're going, folks. The war on drugs, let's not be remiss and let's not be lulled into a false sense of security that the war of drugs is over. It is far from over. And if anything, I anticipate a war on drugs 2.0. You know, as a former prosecutor, I had an opportunity to see the minor offenses come in and the number of Black and brown individuals convicted for those offenses where unintended consequences resulted. And I'm talking about things like the inability to get student loans, housing, government assistance, you name it, there was a barrier in the way. And this is why it is so important to bring this forth because it's so relevant for today in regards to this industry and moving forward. And let's not forget that we have to deal with the systemic racism that plagues our society and it also plagues our industry today. The cannabis industry has no place for systemic racism of any type. That's why we decided to take this issue on today and bring the realities out. You're going to hear some hard talk. You may hear talk that make you feel uncomfortable, but that is not our job here today to make you feel uncomfortable. We want to make you aware. As the young people say today, get woke. We want you awake, folks, so you will be able to take some action. And as we move forward from this discussion, sort of springboarding from the war on drugs, I'm going to go to Julie. Julie, can you just give a little introduction of yourself and how you came about the cannabis industry and where you are? And what does social equity look like from your perspective?
Ooh, that was a big multi-part question.
Yeah, it was, but I know
um,
you can handle it.
well, I mean, like I think like so many people who find themselves in this industry, I have a varied and colorful background. I came from education in the arts. I have a PhD in philosophy. I used to be a marketing director for an adult toy company. And I was recruited as what I call, you know, an ignorant civilian white girl into the cannabis industry in early 2015 to launch a vaporizer company. And knowing truly nothing about the industry or the politics or the history, I entered this facility and then got a crash course in many things. I mean, one of them was compliance, which became my area because I identified that as kind of a key component for any business navigating it, is going to be successfully navigating the immense compliance demands in order to participate in the licensed industry. And then I would say what has kept me here is understanding this inexorable relationship between the goals of the forwarding decriminalization, expungement, and legalization of cannabis and equitable participation in that industry, and how it relates to social justice and pretty much what I see as a best chance revolution for economic injustice generally in the United States. So that's how I get up and go to work in the morning, is because I understand this connection to a larger story that inspires me. And it's not, wow, because otherwise if it was just compliance, I'd be like, what? So that's my background and how I came into it. And I came into it at, you know, a really interesting time, because just to speak a little bit, I think where we are now, it's really important to go through the history of how did we get here, and what a tremendous driver social justice and repair is of why we have an industry today. So prior to my entry, you know, and we have in '96, you had Prop 215, the Compassionate Use Act passed, and then we had almost 2 decades of a largely unregulated market or self-regulated market that grew to enormous scale in California. So right when I entered the industry was right at the time that this medical MCRSA at that time, or no, what was it? There's so many acronyms. So that was the MCRSA, the Medical Marijuana Regulation and Safety Act, was gonna come place. That was in 2015, which would regulate medical cannabis in California. And that was the combination of several bills. And then we were gonna have medical cannabis. But then in November of 2016, we have voters approved Prop 64. So then suddenly we have an adult use program that is also going to be at one point envisioned side by side as 2 distinctive tracks in California, but then those 2 were combined into what we have today. But I think it's important to remember that a huge component for what got people enthusiastic about Prop 64, which was in many ways a flawed, you know, plan, and we're living the consequence of that, was that it had hard coded into it some very substantial initiatives that were designed to acknowledge and repair the harms done by the war on drugs, by the generally acknowledged failed war on drugs. And that driver of that, the populace was, one, fed up with seeing it criminalized, recognizing that it was disproportionately affecting Black and brown communities of color, and this mission inside of Prop 64 to acknowledge and repair those harms, I think was inspirational to people. How that has played out is a different story, and you have many people who really pushed for that initiative who are feeling a little crestfallen, I think, at this point, looking at the complexities of how that all plays out. And many of these things are tied to a larger problem, but I think, you know, the big, for me, the big question of social equity is, in general, when you look at the industry, what do you see? Who is participating? Who are the stakeholders? Who's in positions of ownership? Who has access to capital? Hi, Amber. Who's able to successfully, you know, navigate these the requirements and the demands of this business? And right now, when we look at that ownership, when we're able to transparently look at the boards and the owners and the stakeholders, we don't see a beautiful, colorful salad bowl of humanity. Like we see some real trends towards homogeneity, I'll say.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Just a reminder to folks also, we are taking questions throughout the webinar. So your control panel, which should be on the right side of your screen, if you do have questions that you'd like to ask the organizers and the panelists, just type them in there and we'll make sure they get over. But sorry, Yvette, I'll turn back to you.
All right, thank you, Josh. And Julie, thank you for that, bringing a little bit of the history forward as to where we sort of started from the war on drugs with legislation coming forward, why social equity had to be addressed from a legislative perspective, whether that's on the state level, and then cities who decide that they want to have social equity programs in their jurisdiction, the different rules, regulations, things of that nature. So moving forward with that, Amber, you jumped in at the right time because I'm going to direct this next question to you. You being a woman of color, and folks out there viewing, I want you to say, look at this beautiful rainbow coalition on this screen. This is what we're striving for in the industry. It should look like this screen. So Amber, as you move forward, you are a woman of color and you came into this industry. So would you tell us a little bit about yourself and the business that you decided to jump into and start as a woman of color and what that's been like for you in this industry?
Yeah, sure. So I am founder and CEO of Breeze Distro. We're a manufacturer and distributor in Oakland. We've also got a social equity business, which is a subscription box service. And we push our brands through this monthly subscription box for folks. And I'm also co-founder and executive director of Supernova Women. And we are an organization, a nonprofit organization, comprised of women of color that works to empower people of color to become self-sufficient shareholders in the cannabis industry. So we do that through a number of ways. Through our advocacy efforts. We advocated very heavily to the city of Oakland for the first social equity program, which we have now. We worked with the city of San Francisco to implement and develop their social equity program. And then we also worked with Senator Bradford's office on SB 1294 with the grant program for the municipalities that have social equity programs throughout the state. And so I just took on a new project. The city of Oakland put out an RFP for a shared social equity manufacturing facility, and I won that contract. So now we will be taking social equity operators, concepts and ideas for manufactured and infused products from concept to completion to the shelf, retail shelves. So I'm currently working on developing that whole program and what that looks like, and strategic partnerships with retailers and what that looks like. But we're definitely, the social equity programs definitely really depend on the bigger operators for cooperation and participation in the legal market as well. So there's folks like me on the ground doing hard work, developing these programs and getting them implemented, but they can't be done or be successful without partnerships from the general and larger operators.
Absolutely, and thank you for that, Amber. And I just want to give a shout out to Senator Stephen Bradford out of the Southern California area for carrying SB 1294, because that was the most important piece of legislation from the state's perspective that recognized the Black and Latino individuals including young people, including children, including family members, were impacted disproportionately as a result of the war on drugs. That made the barriers for them just, I mean, it was incredible. So entering into a cannabis space where you're required to disclose your criminal activity, other necessary things, it prevented you from doing that. Traditional businesses coming in, you are prevented from jobs, all types of things. So with this piece of legislation coming in, it opened the door to help divert those barriers to entry so people of color could come into this industry and we could make it look like this panel today. So social equity is an important piece, and the language that defines it is the language that should be used whenever someone is thinking about starting a social equity program within their local jurisdiction. And so on that, Mr. Hua, I'm going to turn to you for you to introduce yourself to the crowd, if you would, and tell us a little bit about yourself and what social equity has meant to you. Why do you think social equity is needed in this day and time in the cannabis space?
Sure. Thanks for having me here. It's good to see everybody. I've been missing everybody so much.
Big hug.
Yeah, huge hugs. Yeah, Meadow's been around since 2014. We actually had our roots from Oaksterdam, and so I think we kind of came up in a whole different era of advocacy when you have Debbie Goldsberry or Dale Sky Jones or Robert Raich, all these different giants that really have fought for everything and laid the groundwork on how to affect change from a local level or a state level. When you look at the organizations like Drug Policy Alliance, Marijuana Policy Project, ASA, NORML, I mean, all of these were before the trade organizations, really were the foundation of kind of what we were all fighting for. And that was just a place at the table. And I think having come up and seeing all of this change, it's been, for us, it's just the right thing to do, right? It's looking at people that have been affected from the war on drugs, people that have been boxed out, people that haven't gotten scholarships or went to jail. It's an enormous debt that needs to be repaid in some way in order to create a future and livelihoods for these communities and create diversity in this industry. So that's kind of where we kind of came from. And so Meadow's taken an approach where we build software for the industry, but we do a lot more in terms of advocating for an industry and fighting for an industry that we can all thrive in, and that is as colorful as this panel, as you would say. The war on drugs is one of the main weapons that created the situation that we're in now. But there's this historic moment for us in cannabis equity that I think will be modeled to other industries, to other states, to and what's interesting is, like, for us, we've spent so much time foundation building. It's been slow. It's been hard. We had to fight each legislative cycle. We've had to learn how to work with lobbyists and how to work with senators and educate them on the learning curve of what's going on. There's been a lot of education. So we spend a lot of time on education, on connecting people, on trying to get perspective and sort of throwing away ego and listening to figure out where we can help. And so we're kind of more solutions oriented. We like to try to get change going and try to run multiple strategies. So whether it's, hey, we're going to work with a trade organization to work with a bill, or hey, we're going to work with a nonprofit to figure out how we can, create educational material to their communities, we're all about it. And the way I'm kind of looking at it now is the world is watching. California has, first of its kind. Everyone's looking at us as a way to iterate off our successes and sort of learn from our failures. And right now we have 10 different counties that have equity programs. More will be coming. Everyone has different experiments on how they're implementing it, and we'll see how we can create some homogeneity between this these cities and have a state program that hopefully will be a national or global program as we move forward.
Absolutely. Thank you for that.
Sorry to
Go
interrupt.
ahead, Josh. Go
One of the
ahead.
things I want to make sure we talk about, and each person has touched upon, is the history. And being a newly regulated industry, legalized industry that is gaining momentum across the country, I think one of the things that we're all learning is that there's a process, that things don't happen overnight, and it requires engagement, and it requires kind of reading between the lines and thinking about unintended consequences. And since the cannabis industry is one of the first to really tackle social equity and make it a larger component to the foundation as we move forward, I think we've seen a lot of good examples and bad examples of how to implement a social equity program. So it's constantly evolving. And as Hua was saying, where we started in 2014 is very different than where we're at in 2020. And as Amber was saying, getting behind Bradford's Bill 1294, there were a lot of us on an island that week, trying to make sure this was priority legislation. And at the time, it just wasn't. Like there were so many other things going on, the industry trying to streamline, trying to stay afloat, that social equity was falling, lower on the tier of priorities for the legislature, for the administration. But it took groups like Supernova Women, like CCIA, Max Michalonis, I totally give you credit. All these folks coming together to lobby in those at the 11th hour to get that 2/3 vote that was necessary to get this through. And things don't just happen without incredible engagement from the industry, and the industry giving their perspective as to what's necessary moving forward, and really giving that direction to the legislators. So I'd like to know from each of you, all of you are involved in various capacities within the industry, what is currently working when it comes to social equity programs, and what do you think would strengthen not only efforts around social equity, but ensuring that the dollars that go into social equity make it to the right folks that it's intended for, and actually build out a program that actually give a pathway into the industry. Again, acknowledging that these programs are kind of trial and error, making sure that they are effective. But what do you currently see as, not being effective, or what would make the social equity programs more effective, whether it be oversight on how dollars are spent, ensuring that communities, that are getting social equity grants right now, that those dollars are staying within social equity and not moving to a general fund. There are multiple things, but what do you see as ways that we can strengthen either at the state level or, local levels?
Yeah, Josh, I'll jump in on that real quickly. And before I do, I would be remiss if I would not give acknowledgement and credit to those that went before us in this industry, the LGBTQ community, because after all, where did the fight really start? It started with AIDS being recognized and those fighting for the medicinal use of cannabis. So they struggled for a long time to bring us up to where we are today. And I just want to acknowledge Indigenous people. There were a lot of folks that went before us, and they need to have that recognition. So moving forward, when we talk about municipalities, whether they're cities, counties, at the state level, the one thing that I believe could be improved based on what I've seen over my time, because I'm one that has boots on the ground. And coming from a law enforcement background, I've had an opportunity to see legislation pushed forward from a law enforcement perspective, and how that has been really an oppressive force. And I say that very, very meaningfully, because I have to take into account where I've come from. So when I see legislation being put forth from the state, there is a dire need for oversight. when this money is being given out to localities, I don't see the oversight there. When a city applies for a grant from the BCC, for example, or someone, who's looking, who's watching what they're doing with this money? And unless we have oversight with these things, we're not going to know. Because coming from a municipal background of 30 years, I know how cities work. And cities will partition this money, they will do other things with it instead of its intended consequence, and that is to go to social equity programs. But when you have no oversight, how do you know where it's going? And one of the things that I would throw out there to people, look at the programs that are not being put in place by the cities for the social equity applicants. That will let you know where the money is going. And it's not going into the programs that are necessary, the infrastructure that is necessary to move this program along. And if you're going to have a successful program of any type, you have to have infrastructure before you launch whatever it is you're doing to make sure you're hitting the right spots. You say you want social equity applicants to succeed in this business, but you're not going to have any success if you just throw people out there or you give them $10,000. I don't care if it's $100,000 with no background, no training, no business acumen. They are being set up for failure. And these are some of the things that are critical for me when I look at this and I ask the question, where is the infrastructure? And why is it not there? When are you going to build infrastructure? What do they need to look forward to? So those are some of the things that I really look at hard. And I ask the questions, where is it? Oversight's not there.
I also just want to say, I think from a meta view, for me, one of the fundamental requirements is opportunity to participate. So when we look at the state of California and that you have approximately only a third of municipalities regulating at all. So out of 500 plus cities and counties, we have only a handful that have any kind of cannabis ordinance in place. I think it's something like only 1 in 5 or less than 1 in 5 allow medical, less than 1 in 7 allow adult use. So you're already dealing with a small pool. And then out of, let's be generous and say there's 150 municipalities maybe that have regulations in place. We have 9 cities that have social equity programs. So that in itself, that not only does the state, which is an industry-wide problem, is that there's not enough access, there's not enough businesses, there's not enough localities that are regulating, but of those that are regulating, it is a very small percentage that have actually carved out any sort of acknowledgement or comprehensive program for social equity. So getting that conception to the forefront of regulation in the market in itself is a huge task, not only for regulators, like in the cities themselves, to acknowledge the harm and then create programs intended to repair the harm. And not just the harm, I mean, that's not just acknowledging the harm, but the potential benefits and why this would be a great idea anyway, to create these programs so that it's this multi-tiered system of having to have the localities, the government officials recognize the need, the agencies, and creating ordinance that affect that, the businesses to create programs and support and systems to do that, and then eventually trickle down to the consumers, creating interest and demand in having this be something desirous that commands their dollars.
Yeah, I think it's, do you mind if I connect the dots there?
Yeah.
I think that what's really that I'm getting from this is, if you look at kind of the macro environment, the state budget has I think a $50 billion shortfall, right? That doesn't include the local municipalities at all as well. And these cities, these counties are now looking at themselves on how they're going to fund their operations. You know, that tax revenue that's going to come in, those jobs that need to go, the real estate that needs to be put in. And I think, you know, we fought so much headwind for so long, and that now like the tides have turned and we have some tailwind. And through the accountability that Yvette's talking about, these counties that have equity programs or have offices of cannabis, their budgets are going to be cut. That equity money is what they have to keep this going. And that priority, that pipeline is what they need to focus on to get things moving. And we're watching LA, you know, and that's going to come up a little bit later. There's a lot, it's a catalyst that this pandemic and this civil unrest that has moving things along. And then we're seeing reallocation of budgets from, you know, police departments and enforcement into communities. And, you know, I think it's this moment of connecting all of these dots, but also like what Amber was saying, focusing on the people that are currently operating now, right? The ones that have, you know, in the licenses that have it, and supporting them however we can to be models of how we continue to iterate on this.
Yeah, yeah, thanks for those words, all of you, David, Julianne, Yvette. I kind of want to build on what all of you said and add some things. You know, I think that a lot of people had like a misunderstanding of what social equity programs are supposed to do, and a lot of folks were like, "Oh, this is a license granting program," when in fact it's not. This is what we're trying to do is create opportunities for folks. So just issuing all these licenses and giving people licenses was not enough. Offering having a loan fund is great, but not enough. Offering technical assistance. Now I'm using Oakland as an example, but using technical assistance still not enough. But I feel like, and also having social equity businesses depend on general businesses as incubators was a mistake, in my opinion. I think with the city allocating funds and creating their own incubators is a much bigger pie in the sky idea and a step in the right direction. So we've got these social equity shared manufacturing facilities, but what's to stop us from having the same thing for cultivation? You know, these are the highest barriers of entry for operators. I mean, it's millions of dollars to open a manufacturing facility, to start a cultivation facility, and we know this, right? And but we also know that being able to manufacture your own product and be vertically integrated is where your biggest margins are. Like that's when you're going to start making money. Majority of the social equity businesses in Oakland are either delivery services or micro businesses, but micro businesses that only have distribution operational and none of the other components, because the other components are just too expensive for them. So taking that data and looking at the holes, and we say, okay, well, we need to figure out how to make these other things possible for folks. And you know, I've been talking with the city about, hey, let's do shared cultivation. That's next. And I was talking to a friend about this, and a friend says, well, we don't have a license type for that yet. And I said, well, we didn't have a shared license type either, and we just advocated for it, and we got it. You know, like the cities have a lot of pull, especially when they're gassed by the advocates. And so we really have a duty here to not be limited and not think in the box. Like we have a duty. Our duty is to bring these pie in the sky ideas to the legislators, to the regulators, and apply pressure to make them happen.
And we are getting a few questions in around these conversations right now. So, you know, and I put this out there to everyone. If you could kind of talk about what the infrastructure should look like for social equity programs, what would be beneficial, and, you know, how do we set up social equity programs for longer term success within cities? Are we just setting them up for, trying to get them in and we're not following through to make sure that there is long-term success. So a couple questions there, one about infrastructure, what it does look like, what it should look like for social equity. And then, how do we set up social equity programs within the cities that provide long-term success?
Yeah.
I just want to touch on the second part. The first part is going to be a robust conversation for all of us, I already know. But the second part, so the city of Oakland's already exploring this, right? Like a lot of these folks are coming up, social equity businesses are coming up on their 3-year incubation period ending. And Supernova has been asking the city like, hey, what's going to happen for about the past 2 years? Like, hey, this is going to happen. The time's expiring. What's going to happen? And the Cannabis Regulatory Commission has put forth some suggestions to extend the incubation period from 3 years to 7 years. So, when we look at our own businesses, I'm in my, I just came up on my first year of regulated operations, but, I was around, I started my company back in 2015. And, we're still not really like in a full swing of things like how we would like to be, because this is just the nature of our business, right? And all the municipalities are really going to have to take a hard look at what does it really take to get a business up and running off of the ground and able to sustain itself. And it's, in short, it's not 3 years. It's much longer.
One of the things, Josh, I would add to that, and what everyone has said has been so relevant moving forward. But when we talk about what should a social equity program look like, God, there's so many factors to take into account. It's not just on the cities or the counties to do this. We need the help of private industry. We need the help of existing operators out here. We need investor help, their input. We need to have all of these people. We know that big business is just sitting on the brink. They're just sitting there waiting. We need corporate social responsibility. We need community reinvestment. We need to have the input of the respective city citizenry to comment on these things, to give suggestions. This is a complete package here. We're not just talking about 1 or 2 areas that need to be involved in this to design this thing. And if we can get everybody engaged in putting together a robust plan, I believe we will see the needle move where it should move. And again, engaging the private sector. I think Hua talked about something that I thought was really interesting and that could be applied to the cannabis industry and having, well, Hua, I'm going to let you go and explain that, because I cannot do the justice you did on yesterday about what you're working with now, the YCYE. And just talk about what that looks like. And from a city perspective, how can that help move this industry forward and get social equity applicants really set to where they can have success, build legacy, which is another reason these programs are designed, is for sustainability long term.
Sure. Yeah, for me, the way I've been looking at this is like, how do we make it easy and digestible from an individual level, individual contributor to make change. So if you're a consumer, buy equity products, shop from equity stores, bottoms up. If you are a business that's helping the industry, so we power software for dispensaries. We have a number of social equity operators we work with. Padre Moo, Cannabis on Fire, Posh Green just opened up, thank God, after 2 years, and 3 Ninja Warriors. If you're in the Bay Area, stop by her shop. Reese would appreciate that. So that's where you can like really help, and you're either giving discounts, or you're helping bridge educational gaps, or you're just being a resource. Whether it's time, whether it's money, those things are helpful. then as a company, not everyone wants to be necessarily an owner operator. Hire people of color, put people in executive positions, have a diverse board, whether it's someone on your board or a board observer, including those perspectives and that diversity helps. And then I think it's really around coalition building. And so we've been running an experiment in Y Combinator. It's an incubator down in Palo Alto. Lots of startups have come through, kind of like Airbnb, Dropbox, Reddit. Some of the biggest companies have come through there. We were the first YC cannabis company to go through. And so, we essentially, during the civil unrest that was happening a few weeks ago, me and two other founders got together and created ACE, which is Allies Creating Equity. And what it is a pledge that other YC founders would have to take. And that pledge had about 8 different things I could choose from, whether it was hiring Black people, mentoring Black students, putting all the things I've been kind of talking about in order to affect change. One big component, though, was around education and healing. There's a lot of trauma that's happened here, and there's stigma that has been instilled in people that need that can be healed, and there's trauma. So how to create an area where you can meet people where they are and then level them up into other areas. So we have about 150 founders that have signed up. We did a town hall on Juneteenth where we talked about what's going on. We had $50,000 donated to a number of orgs that have that help the mission along. We're just kind of connecting resources. So maybe that's something we can apply here. And I think, like what Amber was saying, these big sky ideas start with little experiments, and you have to be able to experiment and fail and learn. And from what I'm seeing from the government perspective, it's almost like a paralysis of acting. They don't want to get it wrong. There's like so much eyes on them. So how to come in as a partner to help them move things along and say, hey, this is what we'll take care of. This is where we can connect you here and there. So being a bridge and a connector and doing things in parallel to different strategies that isn't just single, putting all your eggs in one basket. I think it's going to take a lot of little things to move the needle.
Yeah, I would just say, while we're talking pie in the sky ideas, I think one of the ongoing huge projects is, again, to acknowledge and educate oneself and one's community about systemic racism and how the foundations of our entire economic system, and not see the cannabis industry as something distinct from problems that are throughout all business in America and all corporate structures and all the boards, that this is a widespread institutional systemic problem that has enormous history, enormous veils to keep it hidden, and that dismantling and replacing that system with social equity is the path forward. Like, that is what needs to happen on a universal scale. And that there's, of course, and I think one of the important lessons too, and these are the conversations that Yvette and I've had, these conversations with others, is disassociating like the individual from the systemic. So there's people and there's businesses that are like, well, I'm not racist, or I never did anything, so I don't have a part in this, or I don't have an obligation. And just as the cannabis community has, historically been known to have communal thoughts and feelings, we have to like truly approach this as a community and as a system, and as a system that has to be like I would say not just reformed but replaced. Like, just to...
And to plug in a couple more questions here, one who, folks are very interested in figuring out how to plug into your the Meadow ACE Allies Equity Program. So if you want to talk about that, and then Julie, if you could also highlight the cities that do currently have social equity programs.
Yeah, sure. So, we created this in the tech community, and, for part of that is because there's not a lot of diversity in tech. If you look at it it's a lot of white everywhere. And it's now being shined a light upon from the VCs, from the capital, from the entrepreneurs that they're backing, from the people in their room. And, it's not to necessarily blame, but it's like, okay, recognizing that, and then, okay, where do we go from here? I think that in this environment, it's easy to blame and argue and debate. But if it's a way where you're like just bringing them to your side on the seesaw, meet them where they can do something, just get them kind of interested and moving along, that's kind of what we shaped. There may be a pledge specifically for the cannabis industry, right? It could be, meeting diversity requirements in your hiring. It could be how many hours of mentorship are you giving? Are you working with not just incubating? If you don't have the ability of incubating, how can you work with other operators? And I think a lot of it's around coalition building. So why see this ACE group? We're not doing all of the things with the mentorship. We're connecting groups. So we're connecting with Black Girls Who Code, Black Tech for Black Lives, NAACP, other investors, how to create a way where people can affiliate themselves and say, hey, that's what we're doing. And then we hold them accountable. So every quarter, we're going to have a town hall. We have a whole Notion document that's public to show people what they've done. So anyone can go and check it out. So I can send a link. I'll put it in the chat that you guys can check out. But it may make sense to create one just for cannabis. But, one thing of that is like, that I've learned from cannabis, we are the pioneers in equity, right? Tech, all this stuff, they don't have any of this that we've talked about. So, or they don't even have the language. So how do we kind of like learn from others, teach others in other industries, and just keep working together? That's the key. We can't be siloed as we work. So I'll put this link up, and more than happy to chat after this if you guys want to, talk about that.
Yeah, and for my part, one of the requirements that came with SB 1294 was that the BCC has to post on the internet local equity ordinances. So right now on their website, I believe they have 9 posted. There's Los Angeles and Oakland, Humboldt, Coachella, Rio Dell, Long Beach, Sacramento, San Francisco, and San Jose. So you can go to the BCC website, look under the local equity tab, and you can read the ordinances that these communities have enacted. And then they also have a model equity ordinances that are created by advocacy groups and experts, and then they'll also be sharing those. Right now, there's only one, which is created by the Minority Cannabis Business Association, that kind of gives, there goes my dog, sorry, that gives 10 model municipal social equity ordinances in these elements that they've broken up. So one being having an equity licensing program, equity and employment opportunities, community benefits agreements for other companies, how the money is reinvested into how those fees are reinvested and what they go to. I mean, one of the things that we discuss a lot is obviously it's hard coded into Prop 64 that an amount of the money that's taken from the cannabis industry goes to law enforcement, and at this particular moment that stings a bit sometimes. So looking really importantly in those model ordinances, how those fees are handled, how that money is reinvested, reducing barriers, data collection and transparency. And an important one that they include too is the permitting cannabis lounges, because not only access to being able to have and purchase medical or recreational cannabis is important, but having an opportunity for a place to use it. Where are, you know, unhoused people going to consume cannabis safely? There's lots of questions around consumption, and Yvette brought this up a bit earlier, but I do think it's always important to include in equity conversations, keeping cognizant of what's going on with tribes and Native American lands and the cannabis industry on reservations, because obviously this is a huge you know, impacted portion of the community as well, who have been completely barred for participating in the California cannabis industry, in the licensed industry, without sacrificing their sovereignty, which is appalling. that would be the exchange for the ability to participate. So right now, you have tribes having to create a contained, self-regulated industry inside of their tribal land, but unable to actually enact licensed business outside of their territories without giving full enforcement and relinquishing sovereignty to the BCC.
Yeah, and one of the things that I want to piggyback on that Hua mentioned, stigma. The industry has had to deal with stigma as it relates to people of color for way too long. And as a result, I certainly want to encourage everyone listening today to go to CCIA's website and download a copy of what we call our preferred language document. That was created within the Diversity, Inclusion, Social Equity Committee, and we worked on that really hard because the language that's being used in this industry must stop. And I'll give you an example. I think the number one thing that must stop is the use of the term black market. Because of the stigma that's associated with it, its racist overtones, we can no longer continue to use that type of language. And with the document that was created by the DICE committee, it addresses that very thing, and it gives you an alternative use of language that you can use. And we hope that this spreads throughout the industry so people will know that there are alternatives to using black market. So folks, I implore you, take that out of your vocabulary and find something else. So go and download this document, California Cannabis Industry Association's website, and get it. So I really want to touch on that. So Josh, back to you.
Well, I want to thank all of our panelists for this first portion of our discussion on social equity. You are all more than welcome to stay on, but I know how busy each and every one of you are. It's been a busy couple of weeks with webinars, and I greatly appreciate the conversation. Each of you brings such a perspective, a different perspective to social equity, to the cannabis industry. Your long history of great work is greatly appreciated, and we wouldn't be where we are and even having this discussion without all of your efforts. So I just want to thank all of these panelists. We are going to start transitioning this conversation to be more specific about Los Angeles, the history of regulation, phase 3 licensing, the latest recommendations on moving forward as it relates to social equity, and the licensing process moving forward. So please stay with us. We will be welcoming Kika Keith of CCIA. CCIA is the Social Equity Owners and Workers Association, as well as Madison Shockley of CCIA. They are both board members. And Ariel Clark. Welcome, Ariel, of Clark Newberg, who is going to be giving us a bit of a history on developments in LA and the historic regulatory process in Los Angeles. So give us a couple minutes to transition. Yeah, and for those panelists that want to stay on, please do. Just to give a little bit more information for folks that are just joining us, you are able to send questions to us throughout the webinar that we will try to answer. So keep sending in those questions. If we don't get to them today, we will try to follow up with you individually to give you those answers. So yeah, thanks everyone for joining. Yvette, we're roping you in for 2 hours today. So thank you for being here. Greatly appreciate it.
Well, just know, listening audience, this is only the beginning. We will not stop with this, and there will be other webinars for us to continue the conversation, because unless we continue the conversation and implement changes that can happen at a local level and without waiting on legislation, we will not get anything done. So stay tuned. It's just the beginning. Thank you,
I'm
Josh.
gonna turn off my camera, but get my popcorn because I definitely want to hear this next part.
Thank you,
LA,
Julie.
LA is a world in itself.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
I'll be here, but I'm going.
Thank you.
And I think it's okay that we go ahead and get started. I want to thank again all of our panelists for being here. Some of you I've known for quite a while. Ariel, you and I got to know each other during Prop 64, working on LA County and other efforts down in Los Angeles. So thank you all for being here. Again, if each of you would like to introduce yourselves and talk to us a little bit about your place in the industry, we'd like to go ahead and do that now. So go right ahead, Ariel.
Thank you so much, Josh and Yvette and Kika. Great to see you. Great first hour. Loved it. My name is Ariel Clark. I have been, I'm an attorney. I've been involved in policy reform and social justice issues really since I was a little kid, but not an attorney since then. I've been an attorney in LA for the last 10 years, and actually I have a background in Indian law and working with tribes. I appreciated that Julie mentioned that. I am biracial. I'm half Ottawa from the Grand Traverse Band of the Ottawa and Chippewa Indians in Michigan. And I got involved as an attorney actively in cannabis in LA 10 years ago when I moved down here. So thank you so much for having me. And I'm going to give a short presentation soon.
Kika, over to you.
Greetings. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to share what's happening with the social equity applicants. I am a social equity applicant in the city of LA. I'm a mother of 3, and I came into this industry probably very naively from the food and beverage industry and learning the hard road of regulation and compliance, operating my own manufacturing and distribution company. And trying to translate that over to cannabis in 2017, I quickly learned that this program that I thought was a gift from heaven was designed to fail. And, it's been an upward battle, but we truly believe that it is our obligation and responsibility to those of us, the mothers, the daughters, the fathers, the sons who have shed blood in the street from the war on drugs, to be able to redeem and have some sort of redemption and restitution for what has happened to us in the past. And so I look forward to sharing what's been going on with us, and hopefully more people can join in this fight.
Thanks, Kika. And Yvette, I'm going to have you reintroduce yourself, because not only are you a board member of CCIA and the chair of our Diversity, Inclusion, and Social Equity Committee, but you've been very involved in social equity efforts in Los Angeles for the last few years as well. So I don't know if you want to touch upon that just a little bit.
Yeah, thank you, Josh. I'm an attorney in the cannabis space, and my focus is social equity. That is what I do, social equity, because I think there is such a dire need to have attorneys in this space who are there for the social equity applicant, as opposed just the investor interest and that type of thing. So that's what I do. I came into this space in 2017. I'm a former prosecutor within the city of Pasadena, California, and I spent a lot of time dealing with the war on drugs and all of the different cannabis types that would come into court. So I got a chance to see firsthand the convictions, who was most impacted with those convictions. So it gave me a firsthand view as to what I needed to look at. And when I did get involved, I was introduced to a concept called social equity. Didn't have a clue as to what it was, but the more I got involved with it, the more I began to see that there was a dire need for people to be in the space who had a legal background and could help equity applicants navigate through this maze. So I look forward to this conversation. I think it's going to be great as we move forward and really educate people as to what LA City has been not only doing, but what they're faced with. So thank you, Josh, for that.
Thanks, Yvette. And Madison, you made it. Glad to see you.
Yes, everybody.
Yeah, if you
Hey,
just want to
Madison.
introduce yourself, Madison, and kind of talk about, your role in the industry.
Sure. I'm a social equity applicant as well as advocate. I've been working in the community for the last year and a half, helping with providing education and just outreach and information about the social equity program for people in the community who were potential participants. Did things like bring CPA firms in to hold classes to train folks on, the taxes and how to assess a pro forma. We had attorneys and real estate professionals come volunteer their time to, give classes. So we facilitated things like that. And it's been quite a journey navigating through this licensing process from the applicant standpoint.
To say the least. We're going to be talking specifically about Los Angeles for multiple reasons. LA has a history that dates, prior to 2007 with operators in Los Angeles. This is the largest and should be the largest regulated cannabis market in the world. So not only are we watching it, at the state level, but I think the country and the world are kind of watching to see how LA evolves. And we're kind of looking for guidance, especially around social equity, as we have always anticipated that LA would come forward with the strongest social equity program. And I know we've seen some updates this week as to the direction they're moving in. But Ariel, I'll turn to you. So you can give us a bit of a background on the history of regulations in LA. So if we could go ahead and start that PowerPoint now, Justin. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, so there's a lot to sort through, but understanding why we are where we are now, it's very necessary to understand the history that has led up to this moment. So as Josh mentioned, in 2007, that was the first real piece of local legislation that the city of LA passed. It was called the Interim Control Ordinance. Now, let me set the stage. At this time, there was at least 500 dispensary shops operating in 2007 in LA, okay? Not to mention all the folks on the supply side of the industry, smaller operators, etc. So the Interim Control Ordinance passed. The city of LA said, dispensaries are out of control in our city. We need folks to come down and register. It's interesting, only 187 people registered. They're what's known as pre-ICO. So just kind of remember that there are a lot of acronyms in LA, just like everywhere, I guess. And so 187 retailers registered during the pre-ICO in 2007, no supply side at all. The city promised that this would be interim, and that they would pass local medical marijuana rules. That was 2007. 2010, 2011, the city rolled out a couple more ordinances and asked folks to come down and register. However, the first criteria for registration was that you would have been part of that 187 back in 2007. 2013, the city passes Proposition D, which was a limited immunity. There were no permits that were issued at all. The idea was to try to address the continued proliferation of unauthorized medical marijuana businesses by granting immunity from law enforcement. Again, during this time, it was limited to pre-ICOs or Prop Ds. Now they were called Prop Ds, interchangeable. No supply side at all, and no additional retailers. So we're talking about, again, a bucket of storefront retailers that applied back in 2017 or registered and felt like they could go down, by the way, and submit a lease, business tax registration certificate, insurance, and a couple of other documents. I've talked to people who have said, I didn't know about it. I was too afraid to go down. I didn't think I should register back then because I'm a grower. It didn't say for growers to come register. So we've got then state law passes, MMRSA in 2016, Prop 64 2016, 2017. They're wrapped up together under MAUCURSA. And that's when we have the city of LA make a kind of bolder step forward, really to fall in line with state law. I wonder whether LA would have done this had the state not taken that lead. There was a lot of promises over the years, but not much result, and a very aggressive city attorney's office. So in 2017, we saw LA cannabis permits, regulations, and more taxes. March 7th, 2017, the city of LA passed Measure M. And then in December 2017, the main laws or rules that are in the LA Municipal Code were passed, and they've been recently amended, which I'll go into. So mainly Article 4 of the Los Angeles Municipal Code, which contains the cannabis procedures, Article 5 that talks about where the businesses can operate in terms of location. And then there are also the rules and regulations of cannabis procedures that were unveiled at that time. Also, the city created a Department of Cannabis Regulation and an LA Cannabis Commission. Let's go to the next slide if we can. Okay. So what we're going to talk about now is the phases of application processing in the city of Los Angeles for a cannabis permit, with all of that history in mind. And this will describe where we're at kind of today. But notice I'm sort of trying to go by date because, again, a lot of background to get to now. Phase 1 priority processing. Okay, Phase 1 priority processing, the window opened January 3rd, 2018. Those were pre-ICO Prop Ds. Now we have a new name for this group of 187 existing medical marijuana dispensaries, which you might hear EMMDs. In this Phase 1 priority processing, only those EMMDs were eligible to apply. They were allowed to apply for 4 licenses at one location, either as a micro business or for standalone, cultivation, manufacturing type 6, retail with delivery, and distribution. Today, those EMMDs, Prop Ds, pre-ICOs, interchangeable, have temporary approval. It's interesting, no cannabis businesses in LA have full local authorization. Then we had priority processing Phase 2. That started on August 1st, 2018. So the idea behind this phase of processing was, okay, finally a little bit of a recognition that there was a supply side of the market that was operating. So folks who were eligible during this period, it was only non-retail, manufacturing, distribution, cultivation. You had to prove prior operation before January 1st, 2016, and you have to prove that you supplied those Prop Ds. So again, there was this hook on that original 187 back in 2007. This group had to participate. Also, one of the requirements was operate as a social equity applicant. This could be Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3. And now I'm going to stop here for a second. When I spoke earlier about Article 4 of the cannabis procedures, those implementing rules have all of the social equity sections of the law in them. And there are 3 tiers of social equity in LA, although that has shifted or will shift probably in a couple weeks as final rules. Tier 1, 51% ownership by a qualified social equity individual applicant. Tier 2 is the 33 1/3 ownership by that individual. And Tier 3 is something kind of analogous to like an incubation sort of deal, but that has gotten shifted. So back to priority processing Phase 2, 570 people applied or businesses applied. Today, maybe there are 187 of these businesses sort of left standing. Maybe some percentage of them have temporary approval. A lot of them will, I don't know, we'll see if they go through an inspection or kind of what happens with all that. And then we have Phase 3. Phase 3 is social equity. So May 28th, there was a pre-vetting verification process, a 60-day window where the social equity individuals could go online, submit forms, and be verified by the city as eligible to move forward in these next rounds of licensing. I think around 1,500 people applied during that period of time. Then we had Phase 3 Round 1. Phase 3 Round 1 opened on September 3rd. It was retail only. It was on a first come, first served basis. You could apply as a tier 1, tier 2 social equity eligible applicant. You had to have property. 800 folks applied, 100 retail licenses were available. I am not going to go into the problems with all of that because I'm sure Kika and Madison will speak to that. I will just say that there were a lot of problems, and so much so that the City Council President, Herb Wesson, wrote a public letter saying this was all screwy, and then the mayor called for an audit. So then, and that both of that, I think those happened in the end of October. In the end of March, we got the audit results, which actually were very mixed. So I'm sure we'll speak to that a little bit more. Recently, last week, it's been interesting, last week, the DCR put out several reports and comprehensive changes to really all of the rules, but primarily focused, I would say, on the social equity provisions of the Cannabis Procedures Ordinance. Also interesting, there have been some motions put forward by different city council members, including a motion by Marquise Harris Dawson that will allow the processing of an additional 100 applicants beyond that first 100 out of that 800 pool. That passed. We think that that will become law. We also think that all of these kind of comprehensive amendments will probably become law as well. They're supposed to be heard by the City Council next week, probably all wrapped up by the City Attorney's Office and published after the July 4th weekend. And those contain phase 3 businesses being able to sort of fast track to be open if you have temporary approval. Retail licenses will only be available to social equity applicants, both type 10 and type 9. There are expanded definitions of equity share rules and equity. There's a new category of entity eligibility verification. So this means increased voting rights, control, kind of more robust profits, more clearly defined for the social equity eligible individual applicants. New definition of who is a social equity applicant, which will mean new equity share rules to hone in on who those qualifying individuals are. For example, instead of being based, your residency being based on a disproportionately impacted area, it will be police reporting district. There's a lot there. And also some details about what's known as phase 3 round 2, which will be a different approach to retail licensing, a lottery process. You won't have to have property. You'll have a year to find property, and then everyone has to meet these new eligibility rules. So hopefully that helps situate us in where we're at right now. And that's it.
Ariel, I do have a question coming through, and this is from an LA City equity applicant. It just got word that the equity program reform has been delayed, the vote on that. I know we saw the vote on Wednesday of this week, but you just stated that will happen, the final vote will happen next week, or is it being punted?
Well, last I heard yesterday, this is LA, so everything can really change so quickly. That person may be completely correct. I heard yesterday that the City Council was going to hear all of this on Tuesday of next week, and it was done and dusted as is, basically, besides minor tweaks. But there are a lot of people who are making some weird sausage in the city, so I'm not sure.
Well, thank you. That was very helpful in this discussion and understanding kind of the background of Los Angeles. We all know it's very challenging from many different angles and has a very long history. And with that being said, we're going to turn it over to Kika and Madison, who are with the Social Equity Owners and Workers Association. They have been very involved in phase 3 licensing, the process, the application process, and have been questioning that and the validity of how the process went. So Kika, would you like me to go ahead and start the slideshow?
Yes.
Excellent.
Yes.
We'll put it up right now. Over to you.
Okay. Go on, Madison.
All right. So thank you guys for having us, and thank you, Ariel, for that terrific recap of the process of how we got here. Our journey has been a tough one. Our first slide here says we only get the justice that we fight for. And where Ariel left off, she was talking about some of the things that have passed through City Council in the last week in terms of through the Rules Committee and are going to the broader council to be passed. Those things include, tighter restrictions on the equity share guidelines and additional 100 retail locations this round. They also include delivery licenses for all 800 applicants that applied in that round as well. And there is a whole reformation of the social equity program and how the licensing process will work. And that did not happen miraculously overnight out of nowhere, as it may seem. We fought for that, and we fought hard for a lot of these changes, and that fight has been taking place over the last 1.5 to 2 years with on-the-ground activism, with writing to the DCR in the city, recommendations, with going to the Cannabis Commission with our concerns and recommendations, holding public demonstrations in front of the mayor's events to get the mayor's attention, all sorts of things. And, it's felt pretty lonely as an applicant in that fight. It's come to the point where we even had to file a lawsuit to get justice. As Ariel said, the process for phase 3 round 1 was screwy, and it didn't go right. There were a lot of flaws, primarily the fact that it was a first come, first serve process, and not everybody started at the same time because the portal was opened early. And so we knew that pretty soon after it happened. But for many, many months now, 9 months, we've been fighting to have justice for just that process going wrong. We were basically told everything went fine and don't worry about it. We're going to proceed as if everything was okay. But it wasn't. And so we voiced our concern in every avenue that we could in the civic process until we had to file a lawsuit. And that's where we are today, where we're a couple weeks away from an injunction hearing on phase 3 round 1. And now finally, all of a sudden, a lot of these things are coming through City Council because of our pending injunction hearing, right? And so as applicants, we had to put our dollars and cents together, get together with a small group of us and put our money together to hire expensive attorneys to file this lawsuit. And we're at a place now where we're essentially in negotiations to drop our lawsuit if we accept these things that can pass through City Council right now. So we're really proud of the fact that we exercised our right to due process on our own without anybody's support. But it shouldn't have been that way. We shouldn't have been alone on this process. A lot of people have talked about the things that we're asking for, but not a lot of people have fought for the things that we're asking for and on the verge of getting right now. And, being neutral cost us a lot of time, people being neutral in this process. People looking at it like, hey, it was wrong, but you're going up against the city. This is a big system. That's too complicated. What are the chances? What are the odds? People who talked and thought like that were part of the problem and part of the system that we had to fight against alone. And so it took us many months longer than it had to because people were neutral and people, just stood by and watched. And that's one of the things that I hope will change in this industry going forward. Now that more of us social equity applicants are coming into the industry, we need real support. We need you all to help us make sure we succeed. we need to be supported, not undermined, because we've been undermined this whole time, and we will undermine you back. We need support. We need you all to make sure we win, because we will make sure you all win if you make sure we win. But if you undermine us, we will undermine. And you know, so this process is it's been grueling. It's been an emotional labor. It's been extraordinarily expensive. I've seen many people lose their life savings, and that's one of the main things that's made me continue to fight. Is because I've seen too many people lose everything and are no longer here to fight. But yeah, we need folks to do better for sure.
Hey, Josh, can you go to the next slide? Ariel, you did a great job of presenting the policy side. But so often I find that the human side of what's happening is lost in the conversation. The articles, the 60 seconds that you get to explain your hardships at City Council when they look at the other direction when you're talking to them. The stories that come out in the LA Times are always these, you know, desperate, the poor Black people or the poor, you know, underprivileged people, they're complaining, and yet we're giving them something. And, you know, we felt really empowered in 2017 when Council President Herb Wesson, Marquise Harris Dawson, they spoke about the intent of what the social equity program was to be about. And as Black people in the community where we very rarely see the faces of politicians, where we had, you know, our assembly members, our senators come and say, look, Black people, this is your only opportunity to get into this industry. You must get in early. You must properly prepare. You must read the policies. You must be engaged, because otherwise this will be another industry like the cotton industry, like the alcohol industry, like the tobacco industry. This will be another industry that you will not get in as a people. And as we continue to see in the times that we're in, that our wealth gap is continuing to grow. You know, we continue to be impoverished as those that don't look like us continue to gain economic wealth. You know, we really took heed to what these politicians were saying when they were coming into our community. We really took heed to what the advocates said when they came into our community. And I'd like to highlight back in September of 2017, it's almost 3 years. Marquise Harris Dawson said that Los Angeles leadership enabled the infrastructure that facilitated and drove the underground economy, and that they must take responsibility for the actions of their predecessors and restore the trust of residents. And this was to build an equity-driven program with the social equity program. And it was outlined at that point. There was supposed to be $10 million that were allocated to the social equity program. Where did that money go? We fought for it. It went to enforcement. We fought for the fact that there was going to be community reinvestment. Not only were people supposed to be lining their pockets and creating generational wealth for themselves, there was to be tax dollars. Over $300 million had been raised and not a dime has come into our communities that have been ravaged by the war on drugs. That's a problem. How do we begin to succeed? How do we begin to stop looking for help if we're not being empowered by the very program that was designed to help us? Josh, you can go to the next slide. You know, one of the questions that I heard in the earlier panel, you know, what were the failures? What are the challenges? Because if we don't acknowledge the challenges, and I think that's a big part of the lawsuit, you know, we didn't intend on suing the city of LA. I'm paying $12,000 a month for the past 2.5 years. So it was never an intent to delay anything, but we did intend that we were able to fairly compete. We did intend that the programs and policies that were set forth in the social equity addendum analysis, this was done in 2017. The city said, wait, we can't do a social equity program until we analyze what the needs are. And it was very direct. They were supposed to use police reporting districts to make sure that those were disproportionately arrested by the war on drugs, that they had the opportunity for equity. And when we look at that 9.6% of the population in LA is African American, and we represent 40% of the arrests, there was supposed to be that sort of equal, disproportionate amount of opportunity for us, and it wasn't. They knew that we did not know policies and regulations. They knew that we needed to be educated. They knew that if we were low income, we needed financial assistance, and not one of those things were given to us. And when we look at this, they did not adequately fund the social equity program. Like I said, they took $10 million out, and then we had to fight for a year and a half, protest, sign letters, and urge the Budget and Finance Committee to give us pennies, $1.8 million. A year and a half later, they failed to deliver timely business licensing and compliance assistance. So while you're developing policies, why are you not educating the people? Why are you not working with the community colleges that wanted to do programming, to teach general operations, finance? Why were those programs not made available to us in 3 years? Not one. They failed to prioritize and execute a fair and transparent application process. Ariel mentioned in 2018, we were told in 2017, you had to have a property to apply. So there were plenty of us early on that started to, I know a mother and a daughter that sold their grandmother's home because they believed in this process. And then what happened? They let the pre-ICOs go first. It was supposed to be 2 for 1 was what was in the policy. For every 1 general application, they were supposed to bring on 2 social equity applicants, and they did not. They brought on 108, they licensed 187 pre-ICOs, only of which 4 were African American. That's the start of the problem. How do we begin to have a place in here if you don't start giving us the opportunities? Once they did this, they did not provide any help. They know we're low income, so where are we getting the money from? Why was there not legal assistance to protect us from predatory investors? There were law firms, there were groups that were coming into the inner city communities, paying people in the community $50 to refer someone that qualified for this program in order for them to take advantage through their predatory agreements. Did the DCR, did the city of LA make legal assistance available? No, and they still haven't. Did they decide to vet the agreements once we applied? No, they haven't. They're just now talking about, 3 years later, they're just now talking about looking and establishing equity share guidelines. Well, that's the only difference between a general application and a social equity application are the equity share guidelines. Why is that not the first thing being reviewed? And so when I said earlier that when I took a look at this program and what they were doing and how they were outlining and how they were rolling it out, that it was designed to fail, it became very important for us to take some of that power back. And we did that as community members, as social equity applicants. I can go on this list of failures, but Josh, if you want to go to the next slide. You know, we saw, and we're a people of resilience. Like I said, we didn't come here for a handout, and so we took it upon ourselves. Madison, James, Haley, I had a group of folks in the community that came in with some experience with regulation and compliance and began to teach folks in South Central LA for free, provided a necessary service so that on the time the applications were available that we could properly compete. You can go, Josh. And it is utterly ridiculous for a program that was designed for our community that we have literally had to go back and get out protest signs because they were not hearing us. They were not hearing the calls when we would go to their offices. They were not hearing the calls when we were going to the commission meetings. We followed every normal cause of action, and we were not being heard. So we took it upon ourselves to formally organize and form the Social Equity Owners and Workers Association because we just were fed up. We were fed up not only with the predatory practices of the investors, but the predatory practices of the politicians, of lawyers that were writing these contracts with the loopholes, of advocates that say that they were representing our interests but had their own special interests. And so we empowered ourselves. We formally organized as a 501c3. We are governed by social equity applicants. We are operated by social equity applicants. We have community partners that come in, but every decision that is made and every stance that we take, it is from the complete 100% thought process and strategy of social equity applicants. And our commitment was just very simple, right? What is fair? What is just? What is equal? We're going to demand it out of public policy, and we're going to demand it out of oversight of institutions. And so we formed that this year. And that was formed after seeing the third-party audit we realized that once again, we had videotapes that showed that people got in early. We had videotapes of the process for phase 3, round 1, which was first come, first serve. So all of these seconds mattered, right? We knew that it wasn't right and just, and we brought that to the powers that be, and no one wanted to admit that they did it wrong. And that forced us into a position of having to file that lawsuit.
Yeah, so on March 27th is when the third-party audit that Mayor Garcetti ordered was released. And a couple of the standout things that were revealed in the audit were that 226 applicants were able to enter the system before 10 a.m., the announced start time that morning. In a first come, first served process for 100 licenses, 226 people were able to enter early. The other thing is that they opened the portal at 9:59 and 46 seconds, 14 seconds before 10 a.m. with no notice to anybody. Next slide, Josh. One of the excuses that were made in the audit was that it was the potential misperception among the applicants that the start time was 10 a.m. And that would have placed the applicants at a disadvantage if they waited to start till 10 a.m. And they say, even though the DCR did say that you wouldn't be able to log in until 10 a.m., that was a misstatement. And so applicants had the misperception, right? Basically putting it back on us, that we had a misperception because something they didn't tell us. That was a slap in the face. That was insulting. And it was part of the cover up to shut us up so they could move on and roll over us. Just to point that out. So next slide, please, Josh. So when we saw the results of the audit, and the recommendation at the end of the audit was, there were some issues, but we didn't see any evidence of unfairness or bias, is what their conclusion was. And we said, how could you conclude that when 226 people got in early? That just doesn't make sense. So, they were recommending for the city council to just move forward as is. So we were forced to take legal action and file what's called a writ of mandate. And a writ of mandate is a lawsuit, which is basically a petition to the court asking a judge to compel the city, in this case, the Department of Cannabis Regulation, to abide by the rules that it's governed by, basically the civil code. And we argued that the DCR was not in compliance of the civil code, because the civil code said that it was intended to be a first come, first serve process. And you cannot have a first come, first serve order if people don't start at the same time, which they did not. So we demanded that the outcome we were seeking was the city process all 802 applications, or redo the process again in a way that's fair and transparent and provides equal opportunity for all the applicants. So we filed that on April 16th and immediately got plenty of press. That's that next slide there, Josh. The day we filed it, immediately reporters were on it and sharing it in the press. All the cannabis trade publications, as you can see, Entrepreneur, MJ Biz Daily, a lot of these publications published the story. And we began getting interest from other applicants who saw the story in the news, who began joining our association and contributing to the legal fees that are still mounting up. And just a couple weeks ago, there was a major development where we learned that the city council was going to meet in a closed session, closed to the public, to discuss our lawsuit specifically. So the full city council met with the city attorney in the closed session, and typically that happens when they're asking the city attorney what their options are in terms of dealing with the lawsuit. So that took place on June 11th. And then the next day, a draft of a motion was put out by Marquise Harris Dawson's office, basically promoting processing the 100 that had already been selected and providing them temporary approval. So we took that as a sign as they were moving forward still as if, you know, nothing happened and not recognizing the process was unfair. So we then filed ex parte a temporary restraining order against the city. And the temporary restraining order was pursuant to an injunction on the process. And so the restraining order would have lasted 2 weeks until we were able to have a hearing. And instead of granting the restraining order, the judge just ordered an expedited injunction hearing about 2.5 weeks out from then. So that injunction hearing is still set for July 9th. And so after we filed the restraining order and was granted the injunction hearing on an expedited basis, that's when that's when city council started passing stuff, right? That's when they moved through rules committee, the equity share guidelines, to make sure that there's a process where all these contracts that are going through get reassessed before they're issued any approvals. They acquiesced to adding an additional 100 retail licenses as an acknowledgement that the process was not fair. So they wanted to create more opportunity for more people, and the delivery licenses for all 800. Yeah, that's happened in the last couple of days. And so now the question is, do we move forward with our injunction, or do we, or is this enough?
All right, great overview, you guys, of what is happening in the city of LA. I think one of the most important things that I want to say is that the city of Los Angeles should be ashamed of themselves to put the applicants through all of this nonsense, all of the money that's involved with this, while if done properly from the beginning, they would have been able to now collect taxes, have people working, not only as owners, but jobs for individuals. But with all of the political games being played, all of the backdoor politicking, the lobbyists going in and changing the complete structure of how things should have worked, it would be a totally different position. So again, LA City, you should be ashamed of yourself. Ariel, I want to come back to you, being that you do have someone that's involved in the application process as well that you're representing, I believe. Tell me a little bit about what's your position with what has happened with the COA lawsuit moving forward. How do you feel about that? What do you think should happen moving forward? Where do you stand?
When the issues around the phase 3 round 1 application processing and just the whole process for applicants sort of became known, it seemed to me that the obvious solution would be to process all 800 applications. There are certain criteria in order to be further processed in terms of like distance requirements from retailer to retailer and other sensitive uses. So there would, the fear of the city council, I mean, we've kind of mentioned lobbyists in the city council and what's doable and not doable. And like, it's been an interesting thing to kind of observe and be involved on the outside of LA kind of politics stuff. It's a machine, and it's problematic and hard to sort of penetrate at all. You know, I applaud Kika and Madison for and your organization for all of the, you know, it really is boots on the ground lobbying, and that is how things should. We should live in a world, in a country, in a city where we are listened to, and we shouldn't, I suppose, have to go through those things. But on the other hand, it just is what it is, and you push and you do the work in whatever kind of manner that we can. Anyhow, this, what I heard in response to, we'll just process all 800 from folks that I know who work in the DCR and other offices was, well, that's not politically viable. The city council can't do that. They're too afraid. The city council president is anti-cannabis, yada, yada, right? But they can do what they want to do. And when we hear responses of, yeah, we don't have the ability to do that in the rules, they changed the rules. I mean, we talked about, like, the only actual ordinance is Measure M, and then you've got these procedures and rules and regulations and all of that, or voter initiative, right? So anyway, that's kind of my feeling. My thought has been just process everyone. We still need massively kind of deep. I appreciated the earlier panel was more than reform, like sea change on so many levels in LA and statewide and worldwide. But that's one of many things that could be fixed, and they have the ability to do that.
Yeah, I agree with you, Ariel. Coming from municipal government, the city can do what they want to do if they have a political will to do that. But more than anything, I hope what comes out of this at this point in time is that they will go through with complete vetting of these agreements. I've had an opportunity to look at probably 10 to 12 of these different agreements that have been put in place, and I am appalled. I am literally appalled with the dilution of the social equity interest involved here. And if they don't vet these, what the city in essence is doing, in my opinion, they're acquiescing to the dilution of an equity applicant's percentage for them to be able to be successful in their business, for them to be able to create a legacy. And this is unacceptable. You cannot issue a temporary license to anyone until these agreements are completely vetted, until all documents are provided, so you will be able to determine what does the equity share look like. I don't care what you put on the four corners of that paper, but until you have all of those documents in hand to evaluate that, you will not be able to determine that. And moving forward, in my opinion, without vetting is tantamount to criminal activity of allowing these individuals to be frauded out of a business that you promised you would protect these folks' interests. It's already difficult enough coming into the industry with the barriers, but on top of it, you want to ignore what's happening in these agreements. One of the things, as I said, I am an attorney. I am devoted to social equity and looking at these agreements, and I will not stop calling people out with the predatory practices that they're doing. So if any of you are out there listening and you happen to be an investor or an attorney that's preparing these type of agreements, call me. Call me so we can sit down and do what is fair by these people, because after all, this is about equity, it's about justice, and it is about fairness. It is time to stop the systemic racism within the cannabis industry and do what's right by everyone involved if you want to have an industry that is going to be sustainable for all of you. And that is those of you with a lot of money, those of you with a little money. You ignore social equity and you are going to see an industry that does not thrive and survive the way you think it will be. So I will leave that, and Josh, I'll turn it back to you for any other questions that you wanted to talk about.
One thing I do
Can I
want
just
to
chime in on that real quick?
Go ahead, Kika.
Because that's a powerful statement, and that's the statement we're making with this preliminary injunction. Because we saw it with Marquis Terrace Dawson's motion, we saw it with the audit. They wanted to keep working on the future and say forget what's going on or what happened in the past. And it actually started with phase 2. Phase 2 was supposed to be an incubator program, and instead they let those tier 3 investors come in. They did not check those social equity agreements. They still haven't reviewed those agreements, and they allowed them to break out of the incubation, which is what we need, right? Provide us space, provide us funding, and let us do our thing. Instead, they gave those same investors the ability to buy their license. And so we found now there is no incubation in phase 2. So it started out with there. And we went on to phase 3, and the same thing happened. They picked those top 100, they handpicked them. They wanted to railroad us out of having a position in there. And so one thing that this preliminary injunction will do if we move forward, it stops everything. And it's a course correction. It isn't just about the first 100 that got in, it's about the total dismantling of the social equity program. So when we go to negotiate, and when we say this, and Madison said it earlier, you undermine us, we'll undermine you. You support us, we support you. But we have firmly taken the position that if you're not going to fairly do it to us, there will not be that industry in LA, and it will be postponed, and it will be delayed. So it is important that everyone steps up, the investors, the lawyers, everybody, the city council members, the mayor's office, right? The advocates, the industry, because everybody wants to be a part. Those investors are coming in here and partnering up with social equity applicants. They have management agreements, and they intend on taking over these businesses. So I say this to you as well. If those agreements are not fair, if it does not roll out and we're not processing and having a fair and equitable process, we will not go forward. And so that's what I would love to put out to the people that are listening and understand our position. The same thing we saw with George Floyd and the protests and the unrest that are happening now. We've had enough. And it becomes a point where there has to be accountability from everybody to just stop talking about it and start implementing the right policies that are already in law. They're already written. You're not implementing them. We don't have to figure out how to figure it out. It's already been figured out. Just do it the way that you wrote it and don't dismantle it.
Many great points there, from each of you, and thank you, Kika. One thing I want to bring up is that I do think it's absolutely critical that local governments, state governments operate in a good faith relationship with the cannabis community. They rely on our funds for prioritized programs. The tax funding that they get out of the cannabis industry goes to many priority programs at the state level, at local levels, kind of the whole way through. So having a good faith relationship involves trust on both sides, and seen as, as of right now, it seems like the cannabis community is involved in a bad faith relationship with the city of Los Angeles. What needs to happen to course correct that? What can the city do? I think what we saw this week and in the last couple of weeks with social equity reform within the cannabis licensing process seem to be steps in the right direction moving forward. So I ask all of you, you've all been involved in, all of these meetings and efforts in LA. What can the city do at this point to restore a good faith relationship moving forward? And that may be much trickier than we
No,
before, but
I would say,
I think
Josh, go ahead, Madison. Go ahead. I'll go after you.
Okay, thank you. I think there's a few things. A bold investment, capital investment into social equity is a no-brainer. Taking money from the police department and put 10, 20, $30 million, put $30 million into the social equity program in LA. And just make a serious commitment. And also devise a ballot measure for community reinvestment of the tax dollars from cannabis. Kika said earlier, over $300 million have been generated in LA from cannabis operators, and not $1 has gone back into the communities that have been harmed by the war on drugs. These are things that were discussed as what should be priorities 3 years ago, and I don't see any action on that, or even the serious discussion on that whatsoever. Those two things: take $30 million from the police and put it into the social equity program, and put a ballot measure for putting those tax dollars back into our communities.
You know, I want to say this is a collective problem here. This is not just on the cities. We have to bring in investors. We have to bring in the legislative branch. We must incorporate the cities. One of the things that I heard an investor say about social equity applicants is, let's just leave them at home and let them collect a check. They're too dumb to understand what's going on. The most insulting statements that I have ever heard said about someone, almost like, let them stay at home and collect the welfare check. Well, you know what? That ain't happening, because this is not the caliber of person that we're finding coming into this industry that want to survive. So if we don't collectively come together, as I heard Dr. Fauci say this morning about COVID-19, that you're either a part of the solution or you're a part of the pandemic. And in this instance, you're either part of the solution of helping this industry to look like the people that started it and help serve and help purchase, or you are truly going to be a part of the problem. And I will guarantee you, this industry will not survive in the manner that you think it will. So those are the things that I want to see. Let's come together collectively and build an equitable, fair, just industry.
Thanks, Yvette.
Good,
Ariel?
Yvette.
Go ahead, Kika.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Ariel. Oh, I'll go last.
I agree with all of that. You know, I was kind of looking at these ordinance amendments and this idea of we are not limited. We don't have to be limited by what is in place. We can think big. And, you know, I'm grateful to be able to work with the DICE committee and CCIA on these issues and be kind of one among many and have, you know, participate in this way. You know, as a lawyer and as someone who's been following a lot of the kind of rules in LA, one thing that jumped out at me is, you know, we've got this established cannabis industry in LA, the licensed EMMD group, and it's kind of interesting to see, like, the devil is in the details, right? And I wonder about, you know, there's corporate social responsibility has now been buffered with if these amendments passed, if they pass, and some amount of good faith effort to hire certain people, transitional workers or social equity eligible individuals. And I know we need ownership, and I know, you know, but I say this with, what about kind of looking carefully at the rules and existing businesses, not just good faith effort, but requirement, oversight, certifying or something, you know? So I'm kind of looking at those details and how can we really push that ahead, but also think aspirationally and implement those into the rules. So I think collaboration, absolutely, with all of our different skill sets, listening, and then, you know, thinking big and then pushing in all of the ways that we have to when we want to see change.
That's you on it. I would have to concur, Ariel. That was my first piece is community oversight, and specifically with social equity applicants. I've set up plenty of tables that were for stakeholders and working groups where I was the only social equity applicant. And so I would really urge, not only at the city level, but in particular at the state level. I know back when Gavin Newsom was lieutenant governor, he put together a blue ribbon commission, and I would urge the cities, but especially the state, to look at putting together an oversight commission, but make sure, if we're talking about social equity, that table has a high percent of social equity applicants, social equity workers, who can speak to the needs, so that policies that are developed, that they are developed off of the needs of the community for which you're developing them for. And I think that's number one as we go forward, starting from now, as LA is working out and trying to figure out what these policies are, how do we reimagine it? This needs to be ongoing working groups, but we need to be at the table. And I think the other piece is legal assistance. We know from phase 2 on that these contracts are not right. We do not have legal support. We don't have the resources to hire. So we're using the investors' attorneys to tell us what the contract says. And then lastly is community education. There should be no way by now that we have to go through the city process of RFPs to actually have a education and training. That should already be going. And that can come from outside folks. That can come from industry people. You know, we welcome, as Madison said, we brought in CPA firms, real estate firms. We need the mentorship. We need the guidance. We need the industry expertise to guide us to be successful. It is not about these licenses. It is not just about our generational wealth. It is also about understanding so we can be successful, so we can rebuild our communities. That's why I got in it. That's why I fight. I'm not fighting for myself. I'm fighting to be able to have extra revenue to bring into my community to train the youth so that they can be better for future generations. And so I say it's time that all hands come on deck, that we can't keep sitting by and looking and complaining, that if the city is not doing it, it's plenty of opportunity for the state to start stepping in and doing something. And it's plenty of opportunity for investors, for lawyers to say, listen, SCORE did it quite well with the SBA program. I'll come in, I'll commit the next year to get 5 hours a month to advise, to teach. And that's what we need. We are not looking for a handout, but we are looking for support.
Thank you to each and every one of you. This dialogue is absolutely imperative if we're ever going to move the needle. I know it's a difficult conversation for many folks to have, but as an industry that is building a foundation that is getting off the ground right now, and as the rest of the country and the world are looking at California, I think there's a lot of good we can all do collaboratively. When we have these conversations, when we understand unique challenges to social equity applicants and operators within this cannabis space. And it does take these conversations to bring everyone together and to, again, move that needle, to progress forward, to create a very sensitive and awakened cannabis industry that activates for each and every one of us, and not one sector of the state, not one sector of the industry, but all of us. You know, one of the memories that I still hold to, and it was a couple of years ago at a conference down in Long Beach, and on the stage was Steve D'Angelo and Melissa Etheridge, and folks were asking, you know, how do you know when we've made it as an industry? How do you know when, you know, we've reached our potential? And ultimately the conversation came down to, when you look around a room at a conference and it's representative of the real industry, that you look around and you see you in that audience in many different capacities. And I think that's true for all of us. So I just want to thank the panels today. We've already received really great feedback for the dialogue we've all been having. Thank you for all your work in this space. And, you know, just to close today, I want to let everybody know these webinars will be available on CCIA's site starting next week. We have put out 5 really great webinars this week. I think we've ended on the best. Necessary conversations. So please continue to stay engaged, stay involved. This is a very political industry that we've all chosen to be a part of. It's going to remain that way. So stay involved at your local level, stay involved at your state level. This industry has a lot of power, and when we activate that, we're going to be able to enact a lot of great changes that hopefully will have ripple effects amongst other industries in the world. So thank you for joining us today. Thank you to all the panelists. Greatly appreciate all of you. Please reach out. Again, we'll follow up with some links to some of the information provided today, and reach out to CCIA if there's anything we can do to help you, help your business, help your workers. So thanks to everyone for attending.
Thank you, Josh. Thanks, everybody.